There is no coal left, and your father is sitting perfectly still in the one chair that still has all four legs, staring at a wall that has nothing on it, and you understand before anyone says a word that today is going to be a bad day, even by the standards of this particular winter. That's the problem you wake up inside of. Not a dream, not a memory. A cold, flat Wednesday in February of 1897, in a room on Baxter Street that 6 people call home, and somewhere across town, in a building that took up an entire block and cost more than every soul in this tenement will earn in their combined lifetimes. A woman named Cornelia Bradley Martin is deciding at this very hour exactly how many $1,000 worth of orchids she wants, flown in for a party that hasn't happened yet. You don't know her name yet. Give it a few hours. You will. Your mother is at the window, working a needle through a shirt collar that isn't hers, squinting because the lamp oil is rationed too, and every few minutes she glances at your father in his chair and says nothing, because there's nothing left to say that hasn't already been said 4 times this week. He worked iron work on the elevated line until October. Then the company let go of 40 men in a single afternoon, and 40 men became 40 families standing outside a shuttered gate. And your father has not worked a full week since. This is 1897. The newspapers call it hard times. Your stomach calls it something plainer. You're 15. Your hands already have the calluses of someone twice that age, because idle hands don't eat in this house, and you've spent the winter running errands for a butcher 3 streets over, who pays you in coin when he has it, and in scraps when he doesn't. Bone ends, fat trimmings, once, memorably, an entire calf's head that your mother turned into soup that lasted 4 days, and that none of you have mentioned since, out of some shared instinct that naming it too directly would spoil the memory of how good it tasted. The knock on the door when it comes is not gentle. It never is in this building. Everyone in the tenement has learned to knock like they mean it, because the walls eat soft sounds. But this particular knock has a rhythm you recognize. 3, pause, 2. Mr. Kessler from downstairs, who works the loading dock at a hotel on 5th Avenue and 33rd Street, a building so tall and so new that your neighbours still call it, half in mockery and half in awe, the Waldorf, like it's a person who's moved in above their station, and everyone's still deciding whether to be polite about it. They need boys, Mr. Kessler says, when your mother opens the door. He doesn't come in. He never comes in, some rule of his about not eating another family's air when there's nothing to spare of it. Kitchen boys, extra hands, tonight and tomorrow, maybe the day after. There's some kind of party happening up there. A big one. Your father doesn't move from the chair, but you see his shoulders shift. The smallest fraction. The posture of a man listening despite himself. How big? Your mother asks in the voice she uses for prices. Big enough that Delmonico's turned down catering it because the Waldorf's own kitchen wanted the glory for themselves, Mr. Kessler says, and there's something in his voice you can't quite place. Disgust, maybe, or awe, or the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent years hauling crates for people who will never learn his first name. Big enough they've got police assigned to it already, and it's 4 days off yet. My cousin works pantry there. Says they're bringing in extra boys because half the regular kitchen staff can't keep up with what's being asked. What's being asked, you say, before you can stop yourself. Mr. Kessler looks at you for a long moment, the way adults look at children when they're deciding how much truth a child can carry. Everything, he says finally. They're asking for everything. You don't know yet what that word will mean by the time this night is finished with you. Right now it just means work, and work means money, and money means coal, and coal means your father's shoulders might unclench sometime before spring. So when Mr. Kessler says there's a spot for one more boy, if you can be at the servants' entrance on 33rd Street by 4 o'clock with clean hands and a willingness to be shouted at, you don't ask what the pay is. You just say yes, and you watch your mother's face do the thing it does when relief and worry try to occupy the same small space at once. Wash properly, she tells you after Mr. Kessler's footsteps have faded down the stairwell. Under your nails too. These are the kind of people who look at a boy's hands before they look at his face. You don't understand that sentence yet either. You will. The walk uptown takes the better part of an hour, and you spend most of it doing the arithmetic that has become second nature this winter. How many hours? How many cents an hour? How many loaves of bread that translates to how many days of coal? It's a useful kind of daydreaming. It keeps your feet moving and your mind off the cold, which has teeth today, a hard, bright cold with a wind coming down the avenues like it has personal business with you. The city changes as you walk. Baxter Street gives way to Broadway, gives way to something else entirely. Somewhere around 23rd, a shift you can feel in your legs before you consciously notice it. The sidewalks get wider, the buildings get taller and cleaner. The horses pulling the carriages have coats that gleam like they're groomed more often than you are. By the time you reach Fifth Avenue, you've crossed some kind of invisible border out of the city you know, and into a city that was built for people who have never had to think about coal. And then you see it, the Waldorf. It rises 13 stories above Fifth Avenue, and you have to tip your whole head back to find the top of it, a wall of brick and stone and glass that seems less like a building and more like a cliff face. Something that occurred geologically rather than something men nailed together with hammers. Every window is lit gold against the darkening afternoon. Somewhere inside that mountain of brick, 2,000 men and women are at this moment employed in the single task of making other men and women comfortable. And you're about to become one more pair of hands in that arrangement, and you don't know yet whether to feel proud of that or something closer to shame. You don't go in the front. Boys like you never go in the front. You follow Mr. Kessler's directions around the side down a narrow service alley that smells of coal smoke and something sweetish underneath it. Sugar, maybe, or wine gone slightly to vinegar in a cracked barrel. To a door with no sign on it at all. Just a boy about your own age standing guard beside it with a clipboard and an expression that suggests he has already decided you're going to be trouble. Name, he says. Danny Coyne. He runs a finger down a list, finds something, makes a mark. Kessler's boy. Your pantry and prep under Mr. Chirky's people. You do exactly what you're told, exactly when you're told it, and you don't speak unless spoken to. You understand what kind of night this is? No, you admit. The boy with the clipboard almost smiles. It doesn't quite make it all the way onto his face. You will, he says, and pulls the door open, and the heat and noise and light of the Waldorf kitchen hits you like a wave breaking over a seawall, and your old life, the cold room, the empty chair, this silent arithmetic of hunger, falls away behind you like something you dreamed a long time ago. The kitchen is not a room, it's a country, with its own weather system and its own population and its own laws, and you understand within 30 seconds that you have wandered into it as an uninvited immigrant who will need to learn the customs fast or be trampled by them. The heat comes first, a wall of it, thick and wet, rolling off a bank of coal ranges that stretch along one entire side of the room like the fireboxes of a docked ship. Behind that heat comes the noise. Not one sound, but 40 sounds stacked on top of each other. The hiss of steam escaping copper pots, the ring of a knife against a whetstone, the bark of orders in French and German, and a kitchen dialect that seems to borrow from both. The percussive chop, chop, chop of a dozen blades hitting a dozen boards in a rhythm that has clearly been practiced into something like music. And under all of it, the smell. Butter browning, blood from something being broken down at a table near the wall, the green sharp smell of parsley being minced in quantities you've never seen in your life, and somewhere far off. Impossibly, the smell of chocolate, rich and dark, in a kitchen that is at this moment also processing what looks like an entire dressed pig. You stand just inside the door for perhaps 4 seconds before a hand closes on your collar and steers you sideways, out of the path of 2 men carrying a copper cauldron between them on a pole, steam rolling off its surface, and a voice close to your ear says, "Walk on the walls, never the middle. The middle is where the food moves." And you learn in that instant your first rule of this new country. The man who taught it to you is older, maybe 40, with a moustache waxed into 2 sharp points and forearms scarred in a dozen places with the pale marks of old burns. He looks at you the way the boy at the door looked at you, assessing, unimpressed, already tired of you before you've done anything to earn it. "Kessler's boy? Yes, sir. You've held a knife before? Yes, sir, this is true. You've boned more chickens and split more fish than you can count working for the butcher, though something tells you the knives in this kitchen are going to expect more of you than the butchers did. Good. Follow." He doesn't tell you his name. You learn it later, second hand from another boy. This is Antoine, one of the sub-chefs under the man who actually runs this kitchen. And the man who runs this kitchen is somewhere in the chaos ahead of you, moving through it the way you imagine a general moves through a battlefield he's already won in his head. Calm in a way that seems almost unnatural given everything happening around him. You catch your first glimpse of Oscar Chirky maybe 10 minutes later, and you know it's him before anyone tells you, because the whole kitchen seems to bend slightly in his direction, the way a field of wheat bends toward wind. He's not shouting. That's the strange part. Every other man in this kitchen who holds any authority at all is shouting. Orders, corrections, curses in 3 languages. But Jerky moves through the noise, speaking in a voice pitched barely above conversation. And somehow that voice cuts through everything else and gets obeyed instantly, which teaches you something about power that you file away without quite understanding it yet. The loudest man in the room is rarely the one actually in charge of it. He's younger than you expected, maybe not yet 40, dressed not like a cook but like a man attending the opera. And it takes you a moment to understand that this is deliberate, that a maître d'hôtel commanding an army of 400 kitchen staff for the largest private entertainment this city has ever attempted cannot afford to look like he's been sweating over a range. Even if, you'll learn this later, deep into the night, when you see him with his sleeves finally rolled and his hands in a sauce that isn't behaving, even if he absolutely has been. He passes close enough to you that you catch a fragment of what he's saying to the man beside him, some rapid tally of numbers that means nothing to you yet. Place settings, ice blocks, dozen upon dozen of something, and then his eyes land on you for exactly as long as it takes to register a new face. And he says without breaking stride, "New boy, pantry, ask Henrik," and moves on. And that is the entirety of your introduction to the man who will, in a way you cannot yet imagine, teach you more about this city and the people who run it than anyone else you will meet this year. Henrik turns out to be an enormous Dane with hands like the back ends of shovels, presiding over the pantry station with the grim satisfaction of a man who has found, in the organisation of food, a kind of peace unavailable to him anywhere else in life. He puts you to work immediately, and the work does not ease you in gently. Your first task is oysters, not a dozen, not 10 dozen. Henrik gestures at a stack of wooden crates against the wall, ice-packed between the slats, each crate holding what must be 200 oysters at least, and tells you, in an accent that turns his dollars into V's, that these need to be shucked, all of them, by midnight, and that your hands will bleed before you learn to do it without bleeding, and that this is simply the price of the work and you should stop thinking about it after the third or fourth cut. He's right about the bleeding. Within 20 minutes you've nicked the pad of your thumb twice, the oyster knife skidding off a shell that didn't want to open, and the salt water in the crate finds the cut instantly, a bright, clean sting that makes you suck air through your teeth. Nobody around you reacts. A boy about your age at the next station, opening oysters with a speed and economy of motion that makes your own effort look like a child's first attempt at anything, glances over just long enough to say, "Wrap it in the rag by your knee and keep going. Blood doesn't season the food if you're fast about it, and you understand this is meant as kindness in the particular currency this kitchen deals in. You keep going." The rhythm of it becomes almost hypnotic after the first hour. Knife into the hinge, twist, slide along the top shell, sever the muscle, tip the liquor into the bowl, set the oyster on ice, reach for the next. Your shoulders ache in a way they've never ached before, a deep muscular burn that starts in your forearm and radiates up into your neck, and the cold from the ice has worked its way so far into your fingers that you've lost the ability to feel exactly where the knife blade is relative to your own skin, which is, Henrik informs you without looking up, the most dangerous point in any night's shucking, the point where a boy stops feeling his own hands and starts cutting himself without noticing. Somewhere around 600 oysters in, you've lost count, but Henrik hasn't. Henrik seems to know the exact number without ever appearing to check. A runner comes through the pantry station calling for terrapin, and you watch 4 men wheel out a tank you hadn't even noticed against the far wall, and the tank is full of turtles, dozens of them, moving with the slow, patient confusion of creatures that have no idea what building they're in, or what's about to happen to them, and something in your stomach turns over that has nothing to do with hunger. You don't have time to think about it further. Henrik hands you a fresh crate of oysters, and the knife finds the hinge again, and the work goes on. By 8 o'clock, your hands don't belong to you anymore. That's the only way you can describe it. They still move. Shucking then, when Henrik decides you've proven yourself competent enough not to lose a finger, plucking the pin feathers off a mountain of quail that seems to regenerate every time you make progress against it. But the movement has stopped feeling like something you're choosing to do and started feeling like something happening to a pair of hands that happen to be attached to your wrists. The quail work is worse than the oysters in a way you didn't expect. It's not dangerous, not really, just relentless. Pluck, singe the last stubborn hairs over a low flame, draw the small body clean, set aside, reach for the next. And there is something almost unbearable about the smallness of them, the fragile give of the ribcage under your thumb, the fact that somewhere upstairs, in a ballroom you haven't seen yet, someone is going to eat 6 of these in a single course and not think about them again. "You're thinking too hard," says the boy beside you. His name, you've learned, is Patrick, 17, 3 years into a kitchen apprenticeship that started when his own father died on the docks and left 6 children and a debt behind him. First rule of this work: you can't think about where it's going. You just think about what's in front of your hands. How do you not think about it? Patrick considers this while his fingers keep moving, stripping a quail clean in the time it's taken you to manage half of one. You think about your own supper instead, he says finally. That's what I do. I think about what I'm bringing home tonight, because they let us take the trim, the bits that don't plate nice, the necks and the wingtips and whatever's left in the stock pot at closing. My mother makes something out of it, every night, so I don't think about theirs. He nods vaguely upward, toward the ceiling, toward the ballroom none of you have seen yet. I think about mine. It's good advice, and you try to take it, but it doesn't fully work because every 20 minutes or so a runner comes through calling out some new order that makes the scale of the thing impossible to ignore entirely. 600 bottles of champagne moved up from the cellar, 40 pounds of caviar packed on ice, an order for more roses, not bouquets, whole cartloads, delivered that afternoon from hothouses as far away as France on the far steamers, because it's February and nothing blooms in February and the flowers for tonight cost, someone says, more than this entire kitchen staff will earn in a year combined, and nobody around you even blinks at the number, because by this point in the night, the numbers have stopped meaning anything. They're just weather. Something happening far above you that you have no power to change and no real ability to comprehend. Around 9, Henrik pulls you off the quail and puts you on ice instead. Not decorative ice, not yet. Just the brutal physical labour of helping 2 other boys haul blocks the size of coffins in from the loading dock, where a wagon has arrived from an ice house upriver with enough frozen weight to keep half the desserts and all the champagne at the correct temperature through a night that will run past dawn. The blocks are strapped with rope, and you learn quickly that ice this size doesn't behave like the ice you're used to. The chips off a delivery cart small enough to hold in your palm. This is ice with mass, ice that fights you. Ice that leaves your palms raw and stinging through your gloves within the first 3 trips. Your arms shake by the 4th trip. Your gloves are soaked through by the 5th. By the time the wagon is empty, you've lost feeling in 3 of your fingers entirely, and you stand for a moment in the loading dock doorway, steam rising off your own body into the freezing night air, and you look up, just for a second, just long enough to catch your breath, at the sky above 33rd Street, and you see, for the first time since you arrived, that snow has started to fall. Fine, dry flakes, the kind that mean the temperature is about to drop hard, the kind your mother always said meant a long cold night ahead. You think about your father in his chair. You think about the coal that isn't there. And then Henrik's voice cuts through the cold, calling you back inside, and you go, because that's the arithmetic again. Every hour inside this building is an hour closer to money that might actually change something back on Baxter Street. Inside, the kitchen has shifted into a new gear entirely. Whatever hour this represents in the life of the evening, you've lost your grip on time somewhere around the 600th oyster. It's clearly the hour when the actual assembly begins, when all the separate small tortures you've been party to start coming together into something resembling the meal that will eventually be served. Great silver platters are being built up in layers by men who work with the precision of jewellers, each garnish placed with tweezers, each sauce drawn across the plate in a pattern that will be destroyed by a fork within seconds of reaching a guest, and that someone has nonetheless spent 4 minutes perfecting. You watch for a moment a pastry chef work on something that will apparently form the centerpiece of the dessert course. A sculpture is the only word for it, carved from what looks like spun sugar and ice combined, taking the shape of a swan with wings raised as if about to take flight, easily 3 feet from base to wingtip. And you understand, watching him work, that this single object has probably taken him the better part of 2 days to build, and that it will exist in this perfect state for perhaps 4 hours before someone puts a spoon through its side to get at the ice cream hidden inside it, and then it will be gone, melted, swept away with the rest of the debris of the evening, and no one will remember it existed by the time the sun comes up. How much does something like that cost? You ask Patrick, nodding at the swan, and he laughs. Not unkindly, but with an edge of something bitter in it that you're starting to recognise as the particular flavour of humour that exists in kitchens like this one. Wrong question, he says. Ask how much they're spending on the whole night instead. I heard a number in the pantry an hour ago. Someone said $250,000. Someone else said it was closer to 400,000, all told, once you count everything. The flowers, the champagne, the orchestra, what they're paying us. You try to hold that number in your head, and it simply refuses to fit, the way a number that large refuses to translate into anything real. You know what $1 buys. You know what $10 buys, because $10 is close to what your father used to bring home in a good week on the elevated line. You do not know what $400,000 looks like or means or could possibly require, and the not knowing sits in your chest like something swallowed wrong. There's men standing in bread lines 2 miles from here tonight, Patrick says, quieter now, not looking at you, his hand still working through another quail without pause. My uncle's one of them, was a stonemason. No work since the summer, and upstairs they're spending enough on flowers alone to feed every family on this island through the winter twice over. Henrik's voice cuts through before you can answer, calling for more ice at the champagne station, and Patrick's face closes back over, the conversation folded away and put someplace private. And the work continues, because the work always continues. Because that is the one rule of this country you've fully understood within your first 5 hours in it. The work does not care what you're thinking about while you do it. Your first look at the ballroom happens by accident, and it nearly cost you your place in the kitchen entirely. Around 10, Henrik loads you down with a tray of iced glasses meant for the champagne station set up just off the main hall. Too heavy a tray, really, for hands as tired as yours. But you don't argue, because arguing is not a thing boys in your position do, and sends you up the back stairs with instructions so specific about which door to use and which corridor to follow, that you're fairly sure he's said them twice just to make sure a tired, half-frozen 15-year-old doesn't wander somewhere he shouldn't. You follow the instructions as best you can. You get lost anyway, somewhere on the second turn, and push through a door that turns out to be the wrong door, and you find yourself standing for just a moment at the edge of a scene that doesn't look like it belongs to the same century as the kitchen you just climbed out of. The ballroom has been built to look like Versailles. You don't know the word Versailles yet. You'll learn it before the night is over, whispered by half the staff with a kind of reverent disbelief. But you know instantly, looking at it, that you're seeing something meant to represent a king's palace, because nothing in your experience of this city has prepared you for a room built specifically to make ordinary grandeur look shabby by comparison. The walls have been panelled over, actual construction, done in the weeks before tonight, with mirrors set floor to ceiling in gilded frames, so that the space seems to fold back on itself infinitely. Candlelight and chandelier light bouncing between the glass until the whole room shimmers like something underwater. Real roses, thousands of them, forced into bloom months out of season, climb trellises built along the walls, their perfume fighting a losing battle against the smoke of 100 candles, and the perfume of several hundred human bodies dressed in silk. An orchestra plays somewhere you can't see. Strings mostly, something slow and formal that you don't recognize. And beneath the music runs a constant low roar of conversation and laughter that sounds, from where you're standing, less like people talking and more like some enormous mechanism turning over. And the people, you've never seen clothes like this. Not in a picture, not in a shop window, not anywhere. A woman passes close enough that you catch the full weight of her costume. A gown of ivory silk, stiff with what must be real gold thread. A wig powdered white and built up into an architecture of its own. A rope of pearls looped 3 times around her throat that would you understand with a lurch in your stomach probably by every building on Baxter Street. A man beside her wears a coat of deep blue velvet, a sword at his hip that's clearly ceremonial and clearly still real steel, buckled shoes with heels higher than anything a man would wear for walking. Somewhere further into the crowd you catch a flash of someone dressed as what you'll later learn is a Queen of France, who lost her head over 100 years ago. Jewels at her throat that once, they say, belonged to the actual woman being imitated, though you have no way to know if that's true, or just the kind of thing people say at parties like this to make the imitation feel more important. You stand frozen for perhaps 8 seconds, tray shaking slightly in your hands, and in those 8 seconds you feel something you don't have a word for yet. Not simple envy, though there's envy in it, and not simple anger, though there's anger too, but something larger that sits underneath both of those. A dizzying vertigo at the sheer fact that this room and the room you climbed out of exist at the same hour, in the same building, separated by nothing but a flight of stairs and a swinging door, and that the people in this room have no more awareness of the room below them than they have of the moon. A hand grabs your shoulder and hauls you backward through the door before you can be seen by anyone who matters, and you find yourself face to face with a footman in Waldorf livery. A man maybe 30, sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold in the corridor. "Wrong door," he says, not unkindly, taking the tray from your shaking hands before you can drop it. Your pantry, not floor staff. If Mr. Chirky's people catch a kitchen boy gawking at the guests, that's the end of your night and maybe your week's pay besides. Go on, back down, I'll take this from here. You go, chastened, your heart still hammering from the 8 seconds of Versailles, and it's on the way back down the service stairs, taking them 2 at a time in your hurry to get out of sight, that your foot catches something small and hard on the 3rd step from the bottom, sends it skittering into the shadowed corner of the landing, and you almost don't stop to look, almost keep running, except something about the way it caught the gaslight. A single hard flash, blue-white, gone as fast as it appeared, makes you pause. It's an earring, a single one, clearly meant to be part of a pair, the stone in it larger than anything you've ever seen outside a jeweller's window, set in gold filigree so fine it looks less like metal and more like frozen lace. It must have come loose from someone's costume on the stairs. A clasp failed, or a headdress shifted, and nobody noticed in the crush and noise of the evening. You stand there in the dim landing with it pinched between 2 fingers, and you understand, with total clarity, that you're holding something worth more money than your father made in his best year on the elevated line. Worth more, probably, than every possession your family owns combined, right down to the chair with the broken leg. You could put it in your pocket right now. Nobody saw you find it. Nobody would ever know. You could walk out the servant's door at the end of the night and sell it to someone. You don't know who exactly. You've heard whispered names of men who buy things without asking questions, The same underground economy that trades in stolen silver and unclaimed watches. And the money from a single stone like this could buy your family through the rest of this winter, and the next one besides. Could put your father back into something resembling dignity. Could mean your little sister doesn't go to sleep hungry for the first time in months. Your hand closes around it. The metal is already warmed from your own palm. You stand on that landing for what feels like a very long time, though it can't have been more than half a minute. The sounds of the ballroom bleeding faintly through the door above you, and the sounds of the kitchen roaring up the stairwell below, caught exactly between the two worlds you've spent this whole night learning the borders of, and you understand with a kind of dread that whatever you decide in the next 10 seconds is going to matter to you for a very long time after tonight is over. You don't decide. Not really. What happens instead is that a voice below you, Henrik's, unmistakable, even distorted by the stairwell's echo, calling your name with the particular impatience of a man who has already noticed you're gone longer than an errand should take, makes the decision for you in the sense that it removes, for now, the option of standing still any longer. You push the earring deep into the pocket of your trousers, feel it settle against your thigh, small and hard and suddenly enormous in your awareness, a weight entirely out of proportion to its size, and you go back down into the noise and heat, and you tell yourself you'll think about it later, when your hands aren't shaking and your head isn't spinning from Versailles. Henrik doesn't ask where you were. He puts you straight back to work. Champagne now, endless bottles that need their foil stripped and their corks loosened just enough that the floor staff can pop them cleanly when the moment calls for it. A small mechanical task that at least lets your mind wander while your fingers work. And the earring sits against your leg like a coal ember, present in every movement, every time you shift your weight, every time your hand brushes your own pocket by accident, and your heart lurches like you've been caught at something. It's Patrick, an hour later, elbow deep in a mountain of ice for the raw bar, who tells you the rest of what you missed by getting turned around on the stairs. Not about the earring. You haven't told anyone about the earring and don't intend to, but about the guests, the theme of the whole spectacle. Filled in with the casual, half-resentful expertise of a boy who's spent 3 years listening at doors he's not supposed to be near. The whole thing's meant to be the old French court, he says. Louis this, Louis that. Half the men upstairs are dressed as some king or duke who's been dead 100 years, and half the women are dressed as his mistresses, and nobody upstairs seems to find that the least bit strange. He nods toward the ceiling, toward the room you glimpsed. Mrs. Bradley Martin herself, the one whose party this actually is. She's come as a Queen of Scotland, Mary Stuart, the one who got her head cut off in England a few 100 years back, wearing jewels they say once belonged to the French Queen who got her own head cut off during the Revolution. That's... You start, not sure what word you're reaching for. I know, Patrick says. Somebody upstairs thought dressing as 2 women who got executed made for a fine evening's entertainment. Nobody's laughing about it out loud, though. Not with everything that has already been said about this party in the papers. This is the first you've heard about the papers, and Patrick, sensing an audience, seems almost relieved to have someone new to explain it to. The way people are always relieved to unburden themselves of something they've been carrying quietly for a while. They've been writing about this ball for weeks, he says. Not just what dress somebody's wearing. Writing about it like it's a crime. Preachers giving sermons against it. One paper ran a whole column asking how the Bradley Martins can justify spending what they're spending tonight when half this city's out of work and the other half's afraid they're about to be. There's men saying it's an insult, holding a party like this while there are soup kitchens 3 blocks from here with lines around the corner. He pauses, working a block of ice into smaller pieces with quick practice strokes. Mrs. Bradley Martin says the opposite, says the money spent tonight is good for the city, pays wages, keeps florists and dressmakers and caterers in business, gets spent right back into the economy instead of sitting in a bank doing nothing. There's some truth in that, I suppose. It's why half this kitchen's got work tonight that wouldn't have had it otherwise. You think of your own night, the coal that might come home with you, the wages that might mean bread through the week, and you understand there's something uncomfortable and true in what Patrick's describing. Some tangle of cause and effect that doesn't resolve cleanly into villain and victim no matter how many times you turn it over. The Bradley Martins, orchids and champagne and swan-shaped ice sculptures have, in some roundabout way, put you in this kitchen tonight with the promise of coin at the end of it. And yet you also cannot forget the 8 seconds you stood in that doorway, the rope of pearls, the vertigo of it, the certainty that no one in that ballroom has ever once in their lives done the arithmetic you've been doing since October. There's more, Patrick says, lowering his voice slightly, though there's no real need for it over the general roar of the kitchen. One of the doormen told me they've had letters, threats. Somebody, nobody knows who, could be a crank, could be somebody serious, sent word that a party like this during a winter like this was asking for trouble. That's why there's extra police tonight, not just the usual detail for a society do. Real numbers stationed up and down Fifth Avenue and around back here too, because somebody upstairs is worried this whole thing might draw more than photographers. Trouble like what? Patrick shrugs, though it's not a careless shrug. There's tension in it. The shrug of someone who genuinely doesn't know and doesn't love not knowing. Could be nothing. Could be a crowd gathers outside just to gawk at the carriages, the way crowds do for anything grand enough. Could be something uglier, given the mood this winter's put people in. I heard one of the coachmen say the guests were told to come in ordinary overcoats over their costumes, so nobody standing on the street could see what they were wearing until they were safe inside the door. Imagine that. Dressing up like a king and being too frightened of your own neighbours to let them see the costume on the way in. You turn that image over for a while as your hands keep moving. Grand carriages disgorging queens and dukes bundled in plain wool coats like conspirators, hurrying through a service door rather than risk being seen by the very city whose labour built the fortunes paying for tonight. And something about it feels truer than anything else you've learned since you walked in here. Not the swan made of ice, not the mirrored walls. This, the fear underneath the spectacle, carefully hidden, the same fear that put police up and down Fifth Avenue tonight, and that has, without your quite realising it until this moment, been sitting in your own chest since you first saw the size of this building from the street. The earring shifts against your leg as you reach for another bottle. You don't touch your pocket. You've learned, in the last hour, not to touch your pocket where anyone might see you do it. Sometime past 11, Henrik sends you up again, this time with proper instructions and a proper escort. A second boy, older, named Willem, who knows the back corridors the way you know the stairwells of your own tenement, and your task this time is legitimate, sanctioned, almost a reward for the hours you've already put in without complaint, carrying trays of petit fours up to a small serving pantry on the mezzanine level, a narrow room tucked behind a service door that overlooks the ballroom floor through a gap in the panelling, clearly meant for staff to watch for signals from the floor captain, rather than for gawking, though Willem, once the trays are set down, allows himself exactly one long look through the gap, and then, seeing your face, allows you one too. From this height, the ballroom looks even less real than it did from the doorway below. You can see the whole shape of it now. the vast mirrored expanse of the room, the orchestra tucked into an alcove built to look like a garden folly, real fountains somewhere near the centre of the room, throwing up thin silver jets of water lit from beneath by coloured gas lamps, and moving through all of it, hundreds of guests in costume turning and bowing and laughing in patterns that from this height look almost choreographed, like a dance none of them know they're performing. You find yourself doing an arithmetic you didn't ask your brain to start. 400 guests, maybe more, each dressed in silk and jewels that individually could feed a family like yours for a year. The chandeliers alone, you count 6 of the largest, each one a waterfall of crystal throwing off enough light to illuminate a street, must represent, in candles and gas and the labour of installing them, a sum you can't begin to calculate. Somewhere below your feet, 400 kitchen staff are working themselves past exhaustion to keep this single evening running, and somewhere further below that, in the streets outside, other people entirely. You think of Patrick's uncle, the stonemason with no work since summer, are standing in lines for soup that costs nothing because they have nothing to pay for it. The vertigo you felt on the stairs comes back, stronger this time, height adding its own dimension to it. This is what money looks like when there's enough of it, you realise. Not comfort, not even luxury exactly, not in any sense you have language for. This is money as spectacle, money as performance, money spent specifically and deliberately in quantities large enough that the spending itself becomes the point, becomes something to be reported in newspapers and argued about from pulpits, becomes, in its own way, a kind of violence, not against any one person, not with fists or blades, but a slow grinding violence against everyone standing outside the mirrored walls looking in, or in your case, everyone standing on the mezzanine looking down. Enough, Willem says, pulling back from the gap before you can. Any longer and Mr. Chirky's floor captain will notice 2 kitchen boys with their noses pressed to the wall, and that's a story neither of us wants told about us tomorrow. You go back down. The descent feels this time less like relief and more like punishment. The noise and heat of the kitchen rising to meet you like something you're being lowered into rather than something you're returning to. And it's perhaps 20 minutes after you're back at your station, hulling strawberries now, an army of them, out of season and shipped up from somewhere warm at a cost you don't ask about anymore, because you've stopped being able to be shocked by numbers tonight, that the accident happens. It's not your fault exactly, though it happens close enough to you that for one long, terrible second, you're certain it will be blamed on you regardless. A boy 2 stations down, younger than you, maybe 13, is hauling a pan of clarified butter off the range when his grip slips. Exhaustion, probably. The same bone-deep exhaustion sitting in your own shoulders by now. And the pan tips, and a wave of butter, hot enough to have been actively bubbling seconds before, catches the boy across the forearm and splashes onto the stone floor in a burst that sends 3 other cooks scrambling backward. The boy screams. It's a short scream, cut off almost immediately as someone, an older cook, moving faster than you'd have thought possible in a kitchen this crowded, hauls him toward a barrel of standing water kept near the pastry station for exactly this purpose, plunges his arm into the elbow, holds it there while the boy shakes and gasps and tries not to cry in front of 40 grown men who are all, for just this moment, entirely focused on him. You stand frozen with a strawberry in your hand, watching, and you see for the first time all night the parts of this kitchen that don't get discussed in the arithmetic of wages and coal. The burn scars on Henrik's forearms that you noticed hours ago, without really registering them. The missing tip of a finger on the hand of the man who taught you to shuck oysters. The particular way every single person in this room, even in the chaos of the accident, keeps working. Not out of cruelty, you understand now, but because the food does not stop needing to move. Because 400 guests upstairs will not delay their supper for a burned kitchen boy. Because the machine of this evening has a schedule that cares nothing for the bodies feeding it. The boy is taken away somewhere. To be looked at properly, someone says, "There's a house physician on staff for nights like this," which strikes you as both a mercy and a strange kind of admission about how often nights like this produce boys who need one, and within 2 minutes his station has been filled by someone else, and the flow of the kitchen closes back over the gap he left, like water closing over a dropped stone, and you go back to hulling strawberries with hands that are shaking slightly now. For reasons that have nothing to do with cold, it's Antoine passing behind you with a tray of something wrapped in gold foil, who pauses just long enough to say the thing that will stay with you longer than almost anything else from this night. "First bad burn you've seen?" "Yes," you say. "Won't be the last if you keep at this trade." He says it without cruelty, almost gently, the way a man states a fact about weather. Every kitchen this size loses a boy or two to something. Most nights that matter. Fire, steam, a blade that slips. It's the price of the work. You learn to keep your eyes on your own hands and trust everyone else is doing the same, because that's the only thing that actually keeps a kitchen this size from falling apart entirely. He moves on before you can answer, and you're left standing there with the strawberry and the earring against your leg and the memory of the ballroom above you, turning and bowing in its own private weather, and you understand with a clarity that feels almost like grief that you have learned two very different lessons tonight about what a body is worth, and that neither of them is going to leave you easily. A runner comes through a few minutes later, breathless, calling for Henrik specifically, and the words that follow, pitched low, meant for Henrik's ears and not the whole kitchen's, carry far enough in the sudden lull around the pantry station that you catch most of them anyway. Something about the street. Something about a crowd that's gathered outside despite the cold, despite the snow that's been falling steadily for hours now. A crowd larger than the doorman expected, larger than the police detail were prepared for, and growing. You don't think much more about the crowd outside. There's too much happening in front of your own hands to spend attention on things happening beyond the kitchen walls, until, close to 1 in the morning, with the ball apparently somewhere in the middle of its long, slow unspooling toward dawn, Henrik grabs your shoulder with a grip that means business, and tells you the coal delivery meant for the ranges hasn't arrived, that the ranges are burning low with hours of cooking still ahead of them, and that you and Willem are to go round to the loading gate on the side street and find out what's holding it up, because the man who normally handles deliveries is buried under 3 other crises and can't be spared. Straight there and straight back, Henrik says. You don't stop. You don't talk to anyone who isn't the delivery man himself, you understand? You understand the words. You don't yet understand why his face looks the way it does saying them. A tightness around his eyes that you haven't seen on him all night, not even during the butter accident. You find out why within about 90 seconds of stepping outside. The service alley that was empty and quiet when you arrived at 4 o'clock this afternoon is not empty now. The alley itself is still relatively clear, kept that way by 2 policemen stationed at its mouth, but beyond them, out on the side street and curling around toward Fifth Avenue itself, is a crowd larger than anything you've stood inside of before. Not a mob, not yet, nothing so simple as that, but a dense, restless mass of people, hundreds of them, bundled against a cold that has gotten considerably worse since you last stood in it, snow collecting on hat brims and shoulders, breath rising off the whole crowd in a single pale cloud, like the exhalation of one enormous animal. Some of them are onlookers, plainly, the kind of people who'd gather for any spectacle, drawn by curiosity and the simple human hunger to see something grand happen close up, craning for a glimpse of a carriage door opening, a flash of silk, a jewelled headdress catching the street lamp light. But not all of them. You can tell the difference almost immediately, the way you've learned to tell the difference between a friendly crowd and an unfriendly one on Baxter Street. Some instinct in the set of shoulders and the pitch of voices that reads danger before your conscious mind catches up to it. There are men near the front of the crowd, working men from the look of their coats, the same kind of coats your father wears, who are not craning to see costumes. They're facing the hotel itself, and their faces are not curious. Some of them are shouting things you can't quite make out over the general noise, but the tone carries even where the words don't. Anger, old and cold and worn smooth by months of unemployment and hunger, finding tonight a single visible target to focus itself on. Move fast, Villa mutters beside you, and you do, angling toward the loading gate, keeping close to the building's wall, trying to make yourselves small and unremarkable. Two kitchen boys on an errand, nothing worth anyone's attention. You almost make it. You're perhaps 10 feet from the gate when a surge moves through the crowd behind the police line. You never learn exactly what caused it, whether someone pushed forward too hard or a mounted officer's horse spooked at the noise, or simply the accumulated pressure of several hundred cold, angry people finally finding a crack to pour through, and the police line buckles for just a moment, just long enough for a knot of people to spill past it into the mouth of the alley, and you find yourself without any warning at all, no longer standing beside a wall watching a crowd from a safe distance, but standing inside the edge of it, jostled hard from behind, the breath knocked half out of you as a shoulder catches you square between the ribs. The world narrows down to something very small and very physical very fast. You lose sight of Willem entirely. 1 second he's beside you, the next there's a stranger's back where he was, a wool coat smelling of tobacco and wet snow, and you're being turned by the press of bodies, spun half around, your feet fighting to stay under you on cobblestones slick with trodden snow. Someone's elbow catches your jaw. Someone's boot comes down hard on your foot, and you bite back a cry, because some animal instinct tells you that showing pain here, showing weakness of any kind in this crush, would be the wrong thing to do, though you couldn't say exactly why. For a handful of seconds, it feels far longer, the way danger always stretches time thin. You're genuinely afraid you're going to go down. You've heard stories. Everyone in the tenement has heard stories about people trampled in crowds like this, crushed not by malice but simply by the mathematics of too many bodies, moving in too many directions at once in too small a space, and your legs go rigid with the specific fear of it, bracing against a fall that hasn't happened yet. And then, through the chaos, a face. You don't believe it at first. It seems impossible. Some trick your frightened mind is playing on you, conjuring a familiar face out of a crowd of strangers because familiarity feels safer than the alternative. But it holds, resolves, becomes real. A man, perhaps your father's age, 3 days of grey stubble on his jaw, a coat you recognise because you've watched your mother mend the same tear in its elbow twice this winter. Mr. Ahern lives 2 floors below you on Baxter Street, worked the same elevated line crew as your father until the same October layoff put them both out on the street on the same terrible afternoon. He sees you at almost the same instant you see him, and something in his face shifts. Recognition, then confusion, then something that might be shame. The particular shame of a grown man being seen by a neighbour's son in a moment like this one, shouting at a hotel full of strangers with the same fury that's been sitting quiet and banked in him for months. Danny? His hand closes on your shoulder, not gently but not cruelly either. The grip of a man steadying himself as much as steadying you. What in God's name are you doing out here, boy? Working, you manage, the word barely making it out over the noise. Kitchen. They sent me for coal. Something passes over his face that you don't have a word for. Not quite pity, not quite anger. Something adjacent to both. He hauls you bodily out of the worst of the press, using his own bulk to shoulder a path toward the alley wall, toward Willem, who's found his footing again a few feet off, and is staring at you both with wide, frightened eyes. "Get inside," Mr. Ahern says, once you're clear enough to hear him properly, his hand still gripping your shoulder like he's not quite ready to let go of the solid proof that you're unhurt. This isn't a place for you tonight. Whatever they're paying you in there, go finish earning it and get yourself home by morning. This isn't your fight out here. Isn't it yours either, you say, before you can stop yourself. Some reckless honesty finding its way out of you in the aftermath of fear, and you're braced for anger, but instead his face just goes tired, older than it looked a moment ago. The fury banked back down into something more like exhaustion. "No," he says quietly, "it isn't really anyone's fight. It's just cold, and it's just hungry, and it's found somewhere to stand tonight that has a lot of warm light coming out its windows. That's all this is in the end. Doesn't make it dangerous any less, though. Get inside, Danny. Go on." You go. Willem's hand finds your sleeve and hauls you the last few feet to the loading gate, where the 2 policemen stationed there, reinforced now by 3 more, drawn from wherever the line broke, are working to push the crowd back into some kind of order, and the gate itself opens just wide enough to pull you both through before slamming shut again behind you, and you stand there in the sudden, relative quiet of the loading dock, chest heaving, snow melting cold down the back of your collar, and you realize your hands are shaking so badly you can't immediately make them stop. The coal delivery, it turns out, has been sitting in East Side Street 2 blocks over the entire time, its driver unable to push his wagon through the crowd to reach you. Willem goes to find a longer, safer route to guide him in. You're left alone for a moment on the loading dock, catching your breath, and it's in that moment, with your hand pressed flat against your own chest to slow your heartbeat, that you feel the small, hard shape of the earring again, still in your pocket, and you think of Mr. Ahern's face in the crowd, and something in you that has been wavering all night finally, quietly, settles into a decision. The coal arrives eventually, guided in through a route 2 streets over that avoids the worst of the crush, and you spend the better part of the next hour helping wrestle sacks of it in through the loading gate and down to the boiler room, work that is at least honest in its exhaustion, the kind of physical labour that leaves no room in your head for anything but the next sack, the next step, the next breath. By the time the rangers are fed and the immediate crisis has passed, your legs are unsteady beneath you in a way that has nothing to do with the crowd outside, and everything to do with hours upon hours of work stacked on top of a body that hasn't eaten properly since noon. It's past 2 in the morning when you finally see Oscar Cherky again, and you see him not because you're sent to find him, but because he finds you, or rather, finds the small cluster of exhausted kitchen boys, yourself, and Willem and Patrick among them, gathered for 5 stolen minutes near the pantry station, with mugs of something hot and dark that Henrik has pressed into your hands without comment. Coffee cut with enough milk and sugar to make it almost a meal in itself. Cherky moves through the kitchen with the same unhurried authority you noticed hours ago. But there's a new tiredness in it now, visible if you know to look for it. A slight stoop in the shoulders, a hand that goes briefly to press against his own lower back before he catches himself and straightens again. He stops near your small group, not for any reason you can identify, perhaps simply because it's the nearest cluster of tired faces to where he happens to be standing, and his eyes move over you in a way that feels, for the first time all night, less like an inspection and more like actual seeing. "You're the boy who went out for the coal," he says, and you're startled that he knows this at all, startled that any detail this small has reached him through everything else he must be managing tonight. "Henrik told me. Said there was trouble in the street." "Yes, sir." "Are you hurt?" "No, sir. Just—" You search for the word. "Frightened, sir." Something in his face shifts at that. A small crack in the composed surface he's worn all night. He glances toward the ceiling, the direction of the ballroom, the same gesture Patrick made hours ago when he wanted to indicate the world upstairs without naming it directly. "You should know something about tonight," Cherky says, and his voice has dropped, pitched for the small group of you rather than the whole kitchen, and there's an odd note in it you can't quite place, not quite regret, but adjacent to it, the tone of a man choosing his words with more care than the moment strictly requires. "I have built a great many rooms in my years at this trade. I have served kings, real ones, visiting royalty who came through those doors upstairs expecting to be astonished, and I astonished them. I take some pride in that. It is not a small thing to build something that makes people who have seen everything feel, for one evening, that they are seeing something entirely new." He pauses, and for a moment the kitchen noise fills the silence, the clatter of dishes being scraped and stacked for the eventual dawn clean-up, the low murmur of exhausted men still moving through the last hours of the longest shift most of them will work this year. "But I read the newspapers same as anyone," he continues. "I know what's being said about this particular evening, and I won't pretend to you that I think all of it unfair. There is difference between building something beautiful and building something that a city can afford in every sense of that word, at this particular moment in its history. I don't know that tonight has found the right side of that difference. I suspect, in fact, that it has not." He looks at you directly now, and there's something almost apologetic in it, an acknowledgement passing between a grown man with considerable power in this one small kingdom and a boy who has spent the night bleeding for oysters and hauling coal through a hostile crowd. "What I can tell you is this. Every one of you in this kitchen tonight will be paid, and paid fairly, and paid on time, which is more than I can promise you'll find at every establishment in this city. That is the only part of tonight that is entirely within my own hands to make right. I intend to keep making it right, for as long as I have the position to do so." He doesn't wait for a response, perhaps understanding correctly that none of you have the words ready for one, and moves on back into the machinery of the kitchen, leaving behind him a silence among your small group that lasts a good 10 seconds before Patrick finally breaks it. "That's about as close to an apology as you'll ever hear out of anyone in this building," he says quietly. "Coming from him, that's something. You think about that for the rest of your 5 minutes of rest, turning it over alongside everything else the night has handed you. The ballroom, the burn, Mr. Ahearn's face in the crowd, the weight of the earring against your leg. and by the time Henrik calls you back to work, something in you has finished settling into shape. You find your moment perhaps an hour later, when a runner is needed to carry a message down to the front desk regarding a delivery discrepancy, and you volunteer before Henrik can assign the task to someone else. Not because you're eager for more errands on a night that has already given you more than enough, but because the front desk sits close enough to the main stairwell that you know, if you're careful about it, you can manage what you actually intend to do along the way. You find the landing again, the third step from the bottom, the shadowed corner where you found the earring hours ago, and you take it from your pocket and you set it down, not carelessly, not hidden, but placed deliberately in plain sight on the edge of the step where it will catch the gaslight, the same way it caught your eye the first time, where any member of the floor staff doing their rounds will be certain to find it and, hopefully, certain to know exactly whose loss it represents and how to return it. You don't fully understand, even as you do it, all the reasons you're doing it. Some of it is fear, plainly, the fear of being caught, of being marked as a thief in a city where that word can follow a boy for the rest of his working life. But underneath the fear is something else, something that has to do with Mr. Ahern's face in the crowd, with a particular shame in it, the shame of a good man reduced by circumstance to shouting at a lit window. You don't want that shame. Whatever this night has cost you, and it has cost you plenty, in blood and in bruises and in things you'll be turning over in your mind for a long time yet, you find you don't want to walk away from it carrying something taken in secret, something that would sit in your family's small rooms forever afterward, as a thing that could never quite be explained. Not to a landlord, not to a priest, not to your own children someday, if you're lucky enough to have any. You leave the earring on the step and go on to deliver your message, and when you pass that landing again 20 minutes later on your way back down, it's gone, and you never learn who found it or whether it made its way back to whoever lost it. And there's a small ache in that not knowing that you decide, walking back into the noise of the kitchen, you're willing to carry. The ball does not end so much as it exhausts itself, the way a fire burns down slowly through its last hours rather than being extinguished all at once. Somewhere past 4 a.m, the runners bringing orders down from the ballroom start to thin out, the pace of them slackening from a constant stream to an occasional trickle, and you understand, without being told, that the guests upstairs have begun the long process of departing. Carriages called back around from wherever they've been waiting out the cold, costumes bundled once more under plain overcoats for the ride home, the whole elaborate machinery of the evening running now in reverse. You don't see any of it directly. You're kept in the kitchen through to the end on clean-up now rather than preparation, scraping half-eaten plates of food that would have fed your family for a week into bins destined for the hogs of some farm upstate. An image that Patrick, working the station beside you with the particular grim humour of a boy running on no sleep at all, points out to you without you having to ask. Best-fed pigs in the state of New York, he says, scraping a plate that still holds most of a portion of something you don't have a name for, something involving truffle and a sauce gone cold and congealed. Every year, same story. You'd think, with everything that's been printed about tonight already, somebody upstairs might think to send some of this where it'd actually do some good instead. Never happens, though. Be too much trouble, I expect, sorting good food from spoiled in a kitchen this size, this late, with everyone as tired as we all are. You don't have the energy to be angry about it anymore. The anger you felt on the mezzanine, looking down at the ballroom, has burned itself down to something closer to a dull, exhausted acceptance. The kind of feeling you imagine settles over a man after a long illness. Not resignation, exactly, but a recognition that some things are simply larger than any single night's outrage can move. Henrik finds you a little after 5, presses a folded handful of bills into your palm without ceremony. More money than you've held at one time in your life, you realise, counting it later by the grey early light coming through the kitchen's high windows, enough to buy coal for a week and bread for 2, and tells you, in his flat-accented English, that you did well for a first night, that Mr. Cherky's people don't say that to everyone, and that if you want more work of this kind, you know now where to come and ask for it. You thank him. You're not sure you mean it exactly. Some part of you suspects it will be a long time before you can smell butter browning without a small twist of something uneasy in your stomach. But the money is real, and real money, in the arithmetic you've been doing all winter, outweighs a great many complicated feelings. The walk home, when you finally step out through the same servant's door you entered 11 hours earlier, is a different kind of walk than the one that brought you here. The snow has stopped. The street that held a dense, angry, frightened crowd only hours before is nearly empty now. Just a few stray flakes still drifting down from a sky gone the flat pale grey of very early morning, and the only sign that anything happened here at all is the trampled, dirty state of the snow itself, churned up by hundreds of feet into something that no longer holds any clean whiteness at all. Grey-brown slush, frozen hard again in the last cold hours before dawn. You walk south with your hands jammed deep in your pockets, one fist closed around the folded bills, and your body aches in places you didn't know a body could ache. Your shoulders from the ice blocks, your fingers from the oyster knife and the cold together. Your feet from 11 hours standing on stone floors. A deep bone tiredness that make each step feel like a small negotiation with your own legs. But underneath the exhaustion is something else too, something you don't fully have words for yet, a kind of awareness that sits differently in you than it did yesterday morning, an awareness of scale, of the enormous gap between the room you slept in growing up and the room you glimpsed for 8 seconds through a service door, and of all the complicated, unresolved feeling that gap contains. The city changes back as you walk, the wide, clean avenues giving way again to the narrower, dirtier streets you know, and by the time you reach Baxter Street, the sun is properly up. Thin winter light angling down between the tenement buildings, and you climb the stairs to your family's rooms with legs that protest every step, and you find your mother already awake, already at the window with her needlework, and your father, you notice this before anything else, before you've even said a word, sitting up straighter in his chair than he was sitting yesterday. Some fragment of himself returned to his shoulders overnight, though you'll never know exactly what combination of sleep and worry and hope put it there. You put the folded bills on the table without a word, and your mother's hands go still over her sewing, and she looks at the money, and then at you, and something crosses her face that you'll remember for a long time. Not quite joy, because joy feels like too light a word for what a winter like this one allows a person to feel, but something adjacent to it, a loosening, a small easing of the permanent tightness that's been sitting behind her eyes since October. There's more work if I want it, you tell her, and your voice comes out rougher than you intend, worn down by 11 hours of kitchen heat and shouting over noise. The man in charge said so himself. Your father looks at the money on the table for a long moment, and then at you, and he doesn't say much. He's never been a man for saying much. But he reaches out and puts his hand briefly on your shoulder, the same shoulder Mr. Ahern gripped in the crowd hours before, and the weight of it, the simple physical fact of it, does more to steady you than anything else has managed since you woke up yesterday morning to a room with no coal in it. You don't tell them about the earring. You don't tell them about the crowd either. Not the whole of it. Not the fear of being crushed underfoot. Not Mr. Ahern's face doing something you didn't have a word for yet. Those things feel like they belong to you alone for now. Too large and too tangled to hand over whole, and you tell yourself you'll explain them properly someday, when you have better words for them than you have right now, standing exhausted in the grey morning light with your family's relief, spread out warm across the small room like something you could almost reach out and touch. You sleep most of that first day away, the kind of sleep that swallows a person whole, and gives nothing back in the way of dreams. And when you wake, it's already dusk again, the light through the tenement window gone grey-blue, and for a moment, disoriented, you can't tell whether you're waking into the night before the ball or the night after it, whether the ache in your shoulders belongs to work already finished or work still ahead of you. It takes several long seconds lying there in the gathering dark for the truth of it to settle back into place. The ball is over. The crowd has dispersed. The earring is gone from your pocket and you hope back where it belongs. And the settling of that truth brings with it a strange, hollow kind of relief. The relief of a fever finally breaking after a long, delirious night. Your body carries the evidence of it for days afterward in ways that have nothing to do with memory. Your right thumb, where the oyster knife found it twice in the first hour, throbs faintly every time you close your hand around anything smaller than a doorknob. There's a bruise blooming dark along your ribs where a stranger's shoulder caught you in the crush outside the loading gate, and another, smaller, on your jaw where an elbow found you in the same crowd, and you catch your mother's eye lingering on both of them more than once over the following days, though she doesn't ask, not directly, understanding perhaps that some things a boy needs to be allowed to carry quietly for a while before he's ready to set them down in words. Your sister Bridget, 6 years old and endlessly curious in the particular relentless way of 6-year-olds, asks you a dozen times over that first week to describe the ballroom again, and each time you find yourself reaching for slightly different words, as though the memory itself is still settling into its final shape, still deciding which details matter enough to survive the telling. You tell her about the roses, because roses are easy for a 6-year-old to hold in her mind, thousands of them forced into bloom in the dead of a New York February, and her eyes go wide every single time, as though the impossibility of it. Flowers blooming out of season, flowers enough to fill a room the size of a church, is somehow more astonishing to her than anything else in the story, more astonishing even than the queens and dukes and the swan built out of sugar and ice. Where did they come from, she asks, if it's winter? France, you tell her, which is what Patrick told you, though you have no real way to verify it. They put them on fast ships and brought them across the ocean just so they'd be fresh enough to bloom the night of the ball. Bridget considers this with the grave seriousness she brings to everything, turning the geography of it over in her small head. An ocean, a ship, flowers that had to race against their own wilting to arrive in time for a single night spectacle. And then she asks the question that you find, turning it over yourself in the days that follow, you don't have a fully satisfying answer for. Why didn't they just grow flowers here instead? Wouldn't that be easier? You try to explain about hothouses, about the specific varieties the guests wanted, about the fact that ease was never really the point of any of it, that the whole evening was built, From the flowers down to the ice sculptures, down to the borrowed jewels at Mrs. Bradley Martin's throat. Around the deliberate, almost theatrical difficulty of the thing, that spending a fortune to make something difficult look effortless was, in some way, you're still working out how to name properly the entire performance the evening was staged to give. Bridget doesn't fully follow the explanation, and you're not entirely sure you follow it yourself, but she nods anyway, satisfied enough for now, and goes back to asking about the queens. Willem, when you see him again a few days later at another smaller job Henrik calls you both in for, tells you he never fully calmed down that first night, that he lay awake past dawn with his heart still going too fast, replaying the moment the police line buckled and the crowd poured through. I keep thinking about how close that was to going badly, he says. Lo, while you work side by side shelling a mountain of shrimp for a dinner that will never come close to matching the scale of what you both survived together. Not for us specifically, just badly for anyone. All it takes is one more push in the wrong direction, and a night like that turns into something people read about in the papers for the wrong reasons entirely. You think about that a great deal in the days that follow, the narrowness of the margin between the night you actually lived through and some worse version of it that never quite arrived. You think about Mr. Ahern's hand on your shoulder, steadying you as much as steadying himself, and about how easily that same crowd, in a slightly different configuration of luck and temperature and police discipline, might have become something neither of you walked away from unhurt. It's a strange kind of gratitude to carry. Gratitude not for what happened, but for what didn't, and you find you don't entirely know what to do with it, so you mostly just carry it quietly, the way you carry most of what that night gave you, tucked away somewhere private, taken out and turned over only in the particular hush of an evening when the rest of the household has gone still around you. The city does not forget the Bradley Martin ball quickly, and neither in truth do you. For days afterward, the papers your father sometimes brings home from a neighbour who's finished with them are full of it. Not just the guest lists and the descriptions of gowns, which read to you now with a strange dual vision, half recognition and half disbelief, since you were standing 11 hours in the building where all of it happened and yet somehow still didn't see the half of it that the reporters seem to have captured. What surprises you more is how much of the coverage isn't admiring at all. Column after column argues about what the evening means, what it cost, whether $400,000 spent on orchids and ice sculptures and a night's entertainment for a few hundred people represents a kind of civic generosity, spreading money through the pockets of florists and dressmakers and caterers and, yes, kitchen boys like you, or whether it represents something closer to an obscenity, a studied indifference to the suffering going on in plain sight of the very avenue the guests' carriages rolled down. You read one column twice, sitting on the tenement stairs where the light is better than inside, because something in it catches at the same tangle of feeling that's been sitting in your chest since that night. A minister, somewhere uptown, preaching that the ball represented everything wrong with a city that could spend a fortune on a single evening's costume party, while its own citizens queued for bread within walking distance of the front door. You think of the bread lines Patrick mentioned. You think of Mr. Ahern's face in the crowd. You think, too, of the folded bills on your family's table, of the coal that's kept your rooms warmer this month than they've been all winter, and you understand, reading the minister's fury, that he isn't entirely wrong, and also that he isn't entirely right, and that the truth of the thing sits somewhere in the uncomfortable middle where most true things seem to live. What you learn later, weeks later, second-hand from Patrick, who hears it from someone in the front office at the Waldorf, is that the consequences of that single night reach further than either of you expected. The city's tax assessors, apparently stung by the same public outrage that filled the newspaper columns, take a fresh look at the Bradley Martins' declared wealth in the aftermath of a party that so publicly demonstrated just how much money the family had at its disposal to spend on a single evening's entertainment. Their personal property assessment, which had sat for years at a modest figure that bore little resemblance to their actual fortune, gets revised sharply upward. More than tripled, Patrick tells you, his eyebrows raised at the sheer scale of it, a fact that seems to delight him in a way that has nothing to do with malice and everything to do with the simple satisfaction of watching consequence finally arrive somewhere it's been overdue. Mrs. Bradley Martin, by every account that reaches you, does not take this development gracefully. There's talk, within the year, of the family closing up their house and leaving the city altogether. For England, someone says, where a fortune like theirs apparently draws less public scrutiny and buys, among other things, a title that no amount of money in New York could have purchased them. You never learn if all of it is true in every detail. News like this arrives in your world second-hand and third-hand, filtered through kitchen gossip and the front pages of papers that don't always agree with each other. But the broad shape of it holds steady enough over the following months that you come to believe most of it. The ball that was meant to be the crowning triumph of the Bradley Martins' social ambitions becomes, instead, the beginning of their quiet, permanent departure from the city, whose newspapers had spent a cold February savaging them for it. You think about that sometimes, on your own walks home from whatever work fills your evenings that season, because there is more work, as Henrik promised, though none of it ever again quite matches the strange vertiginous intensity of that first single night. A grand family, at the absolute peak of what money could apparently purchase in this city, so stung by public judgment that they eventually pack up their house and leave the country over it. And a few miles south, in rooms with cracked plaster and windows that never quite keep out the cold, families who have no house to pack up, no country to flee to, simply endure the way they've always endured, the way you suspect they'll go on enduring long after the Bradley Martins' name has faded from anyone's memory at all. You don't know, standing in the middle of that particular winter, which of those two outcomes represents anything like justice. You're not sure at 15 that you have the tools yet to answer a question that large. What you do know, with more certainty than you have about almost anything else that winter, is which of the two lives you'd rather be living, and it surprises you a little, turning the question over on your walks home, that the answer isn't quite as simple as you'd have guessed the night you first climbed those 13 stories of brick and stone, with your stomach in knots and your hands scrubbed raw under your nails. There is comfort, you decide eventually, in work that leaves you tired the way honest labour leaves a person tired. The good ache of muscles that did something real, rather than the strange hollow feeling you imagine must come from spending a life arranging spectacles that other people will spend just as much energy resenting you for. You don't romanticize it. Your family is still cold some nights that winter. Your father is still out of steady work more often than he'd like, and the arithmetic of coal and bread still occupies more of your daily thinking than any 15-year-old should have to spend on it. But there's a clarity in it too, a straightforwardness that you suspect the Bradley Martins, for all their money, might never have access to at all. The simple, uncomplicated knowledge of exactly what a day's work is worth and exactly who it feeds, and exactly why it matters. You go back to the Waldorf kitchen more times than you expect to that year and the next. Not every week, not even every month, but often enough that Henrik starts to recognize you by name rather than by the general category of new boy. Often enough that Antoine trusts you with a proper knife rather than the dull practice blades handed to the truly unproven. Often enough that the building itself stops feeling like a foreign country and starts feeling, in its own strange way, like a second and much stranger home. One where you belong for 8 or 10 or 12 hours at a stretch and then are released back out into the world you actually live in. The way a man might visit a relation's grand house without ever quite believing he could live there himself. You never see anything again quite like the night of the ball. Nothing in this city, you come to understand, quite matches that particular fever. The flowers alone, the ice sculptures, the sheer concentrated wealth of that single evening remains, even a year later, the subject people bring up when they want to describe extravagance at its most extreme, a shorthand that needs no further explanation among anyone who lived in this city that winter. But there are other grand dinners, other society weddings, other nights when the kitchen fills past capacity, and every hand that's proven itself reliable gets called back in, and you work enough of them that the rhythms stop frightening you the way they did that first night. Your hands learn to shuck oysters without bleeding. Your shoulders learn to carry ice without shaking by the fourth trip. You learn, the way Patrick told you to that first night, to think about your own supper instead of the one being served upstairs, though you never quite managed to stop thinking about both entirely. Some part of you always aware of the twin arithmetic running underneath every grand meal you help assemble. Late that same year, a new boy arrives at the pantry station, younger than you were, barely 13, sent by some cousin of Mr. Kessler's, who's heard there's steady work to be found for boys willing to learn fast and complain little, and you find yourself, without quite deciding to, becoming the one who shows him where to stand, how to hold the oyster knife so it doesn't skid, which stations to avoid during the worst crush of a rush. His name is Thomas, and he has the same wide, half-frightened eyes you must have had that first night, the same tendency to flinch at the noise before he learns to let it wash over him instead. Walk on the walls, you tell him, the same first thing Antoine told you, though you don't fully understand until you're saying it yourself how strange it feels to be the one passing a rule down rather than receiving it. Never the middle. The middle is where the food moves. He nods, wide-eyed, and you watch something in him settle slightly at having a rule to hold on to. The way rules always help in a place that otherwise makes no sense at all to a person seeing it for the first time. It gets easier, you tell him later, when his hands are shaking with cold and exhaustion after his first stretch of real work, echoing something Patrick told you once. A phrase you understand now to be a kind of currency that passes between boys like you in kitchens like this. Not quite a lie, not quite the whole truth either, but a kindness offered in the only form that's available to offer it in. Does it? Thomas asks, and there's real doubt in his voice. The doubt of a boy who cannot yet imagine a version of himself that isn't exhausted and half frozen and entirely uncertain whether he'll manage to keep his footing through the rest of the night. Some of it, you say, because you've learned by now that the whole truth serves a person better than the comfortable half of it, even when the comfortable half is what they're hoping to hear. The work gets easier. Your hands learn what they're doing, but some of what you'll see and hear, some of that doesn't get easier exactly. You just learn to carry it better. You think, saying this, of the ballroom glimpse through a service door, of the burned boy plunged elbow deep into a barrel of water while 400 guests upstairs never once paused their supper to wonder why, of Mr. Aherne's face in the crush of the crowd, and the earring left deliberately on a shadowed step, and the strange dual vision that settled into you permanently now. The ability to hold two entirely different truths about this city in your head at the same time without either one cancelling the other out. These seasons turn the way they always do, regardless of what any single night contains. Summer brings its own kind of misery to the kitchen, the heat off the ranges compounding the heat already pressing down through the city's brick and pavement. The smell of spoiling food a constant low threat against which the whole operation wages a daily, exhausting war. Autumn brings the society season back into full swing, dinner after dinner, ball after ball, though none, as you've noted, ever quite reaching the scale of that first February night. Winter comes around again, and you find yourself on the anniversary of the Bradley Martin ball almost to the week, standing once more at the pantry station with an oyster knife in your raw hands, and you notice, without quite meaning to, that your body has stopped protesting the work the way it protested that very first night. The shoulders that ached after 600 oysters now manage twice that number without complaint. The fingers that lost feeling in the cold now know, almost instinctively, how far they can push before real danger sets in. You've become, without entirely noticing the transition happen, someone reliable in a trade that runs entirely on reliability. The kind of boy Henrik trusts to send up with a full tray without checking twice. The kind of boy Antoine will hand a proper blade to without a lecture attached. The kind of boy a frightened new arrival gets pointed toward when he needs someone to explain, in plain language, how this whole strange country operates and how a person survives inside it. Your father finds steady work again that spring. Not the same work, not the elevated line, but something close enough in wages that the coal stops being a daily calculation and becomes instead simply a monthly one, which feels, after that winter, almost like luxury in itself. You keep working the Waldorf kitchen anyway some nights, because the money is good and because, you admit to yourself slowly over that year, there's something in the work itself you've come to value beyond the wages. The particular satisfaction of a station cleared and organised, of a task done cleanly under pressure, of being one small, reliable part of a machine so large it takes 400 people working in concert just to keep it running for a single night. You never forget the ballroom, though. Not the mirrors, not the roses forced into bloom out of season, not the 8 seconds of vertigo standing in that doorway with the tray shaking in your hands. You carry it the way you carry the memory of the crowd outside, the way you carry Mr. Aherne's face and the weight of the earring against your leg and the sound of a 13-year-old boy screaming as hot butter caught his arm. All of it sits in you now, permanently, the way the city itself seems built from nothing but such contradictions stacked one on top of another. Grandeur over hunger, spectacle over survival, a room full of mirrors built directly above a room full of coal fires. Both of them, somehow, part of the very same building. On quiet nights, when there's no grand dinner calling you uptown, and the tenement has settled into the particular hush that falls over Baxter Street sometime after the last vendors have wheeled their carts home, you sometimes sit by the narrow window in your family's rooms and watch the street go dark below, and you let your mind wander back over everything that single night taught you, turning it the way you'd turn a stone in your palm, looking for the angle that finally makes sense of it. You think about Henrik's scarred forearms and the oyster knife that took 2 days to stop leaving your thumb tender at the joint, You think about the 600 quail, small and fragile under your hands, and Patrick's advice to think about your own supper instead of the one you were building for strangers, advice you understand better now than you did the night you first heard it. You think about the swan carved from spun sugar and ice, 3 feet of wingspan built over 2 days by a man whose name you never learned, destroyed within hours by a spoon reaching for the ice cream hidden at its centre, and how that image has stayed with you longer than almost anything else from that night. Not the waste of it exactly, though there is waste in it, but the strange bravery of building something so deliberately temporary, something made with 2 days of a man's skill and care in the full knowledge that it would exist in its perfect state for only a handful of hours. You think about the mirrors, how the ballroom folded back on itself infinitely in that gilded glass, candlelight bouncing between reflections until the whole room seemed to hold more people than could possibly have fit inside it. An illusion of abundance layered on top of an actual abundance that hardly needed the illusion to overwhelm you in the first place. You wonder sometimes whether the people who danced in that room ever noticed the mirrors doing that, whether wealth at that scale eventually stops seeing its own reflection at all, becomes so used to abundance that abundance simply becomes the water it swims in, invisible the way the air is invisible to anyone who's never had to fight for breath. You think about Mrs. Bradley Martin, whom you never once saw directly, only glimpsed second-hand through Patrick's description. A Queen of Scotland who lost her head, jewels once worn, they said, by a Queen of France who lost hers too. A woman apparently untroubled by dressing herself as 2 separate historical tragedies for one evening's entertainment. You wonder whether she understood, standing in that mirrored room in her borrowed grandeur, anything at all about the crowd gathering in the cold outside her window, about the working men whose fury she'd become without ever meeting a single one of them, the focus of. You decide eventually that it doesn't matter much whether she understood or not. The consequence arrived regardless. The tax assessors, the newspapers, the slow public unravelling that eventually sent her family across an ocean, rather than face another winter under this city's judgment. Understanding you're coming to learn isn't always required for consequence to find you. Sometimes it just finds you anyway, the way winter finds a family with no coal whether or not anyone intended it that way. You think too about your own family's rooms, 2 floors below where Mr. Ahern still lives, still walks the same crew shifts when work is available, still nods to you gravely on the stairs some mornings in a way that seems to acknowledge, without either of you ever saying it aloud, the strange thing that passed between you in that crowd, a grown man's shame at being seen, a boy's fear of being crushed, both of you caught for a handful of seconds in the same tangled moment outside a hotel. Neither of you could ever afford to enter through the front door. You think about the earrings still, more often than you expected you would. You never learn its fate for certain, and some nights you allow yourself to imagine it landing back in the jewellery box of whoever lost it, restored without incident, a small crisis in someone else's evening resolved by an honest floor attendant doing his job. Other nights you imagine something less tidy, the earrings swept up with the rest of the debris of the evening, lost anyway despite your choice, or claimed by someone with fewer scruples than you managed to find in yourself on that landing. You've decided, over the months since, that the uncertainty doesn't actually matter as much as you once thought it would. What matters is what you did with the 10 seconds you had to decide. Standing on that step with your family's whole hard winter weighing on one side of the scale, and something you couldn't quite name weighing on the other. You made the choice you could live with afterward. That turns out to be worth more in the accounting you've come to trust than the money the earring might have brought you, though you won't pretend some cold February nights don't find you wandering anyway, in the honest small hours when a person's thoughts go places their daylight self would rather they didn't. Your mother asks you sometimes, on the night you come home from a Waldorf shift smelling of butter and coal smoke and exhaustion, what it's like up there. Not the work itself, which she understands well enough from a lifetime of her own labour, but the rooms, the guests, the sheer scale of a wealth she's never once seen with her own eyes, and likely never will. You try, each time, to find better words for it than you managed the time before. You tell her about the mirrors, the roses out of season, the swan made of sugar and ice. You don't tell her, not directly, about the fear that sits underneath all of it now whenever you think back on that first night. The fear you learned standing in that crowd. The fear the guests themselves apparently carried too, bundled in their plain overcoats to hide their costumes from the very street they'd have to pass through to reach their own front door. She listens to all of it with the particular patient attention she's always given you, and when you're finished, she usually says some version of the same thing, a small worn phrase that's become, over the year, something like a private understanding between the two of you. 2 worlds, she says. Same city. Doesn't seem right, does it? No, you tell her every time. It doesn't. Well, she says, and goes back to her needlework. The lamp oil no longer rationed quite so carefully, now that your father's wages have steadied, and your own contributions have added their own small weight to the family's accounting. You've seen both of them now, at least. That's more than most people manage in a whole life. Might be worth something someday, having seen it all so young. You're not sure yet what that worth will turn out to be. You're 15, going on 16, and the future stretches out ahead of you as unmapped as it does for any boy your age in any tenement on this island, full of choices you haven't had to make yet and consequences you can't yet imagine clearly enough to fear or hope for in any specific way. But you carry the ball with you regardless. The whole long night of it. The oysters and the ice and the fire, the mirrors and the crowd and the earring left on a shadowed step. And you suspect, sitting by the window watching Baxter Street settle into its late evening quiet, that you will go on carrying it for a very long time yet, the way a person carries the first proof they ever received that the world contains more than the single narrow slice of it they were born into. There's one more evening that year worth telling, because it's the evening that finally settles, for you, the question you'd been carrying since the mezzanine gap in the panelling first showed you the ballroom in its full, terrible splendour. It happens in early spring, almost 14 months after the ball itself, on a night when the Waldorf kitchen is busy but not overwhelmed. A wedding supper, modest by the standards of that building, though it would have seemed like unimaginable extravagance on Baxter Street. And Henrik, in a mood generous enough to surprise you, sends you and Thomas up together near the end of the evening, with instructions to help clear glassware from the mezzanine pantry. The same small room where Willem first showed you the gap in the panelling all those months ago. Thomas has grown into the work faster than you did, or perhaps you've simply forgotten how frightened you were at his age. The way memory smooths its own hard edges given enough time. He moves through the pantry with an easy confidence now, stacking glasses without a wasted motion, and when the work is done and there's a stolen minute before Henrik will notice your absence, you find yourself doing exactly what Willem did for you that first night. Pulling him gently toward the gap in the panelling, offering him the same forbidden look you were given, understanding only now, offering it, why Willem chose to share it with you, rather than simply hurry you past. The ballroom below is smaller in scale tonight than it was that February. A wedding, not a spectacle built to outdo every party this city has ever thrown. But it holds still the same essential elements. The mirrors, the flowers, though fewer of them, and in season this time. The orchestra, the silk, the particular golden light of a room built entirely around the display of wealth as a kind of art form in itself. Tomas's eyes go wide the way yours must have, standing here for the first time, and you watch him take it in with the same 8 seconds of vertigo you remember from your own first look, the world tilting slightly on its axis as a boy from a cold tenement room absorbs for the first time the sheer scale of what money can build when there's enough of it stacked in one family's hands. "Is it always like this?" he asks, voice hushed. The same question every kitchen boy seems to ask on his first proper look at the world above the stairs. "Not always this grand," you tell him, thinking of the ball, of the swan made of sugar and ice, of 600 oysters and a crowd gathering angry in the snow. "I saw it grander than this once, grander than you'll likely ever see it again, unless this city decides to lose its mind again the way it did that winter." What happened? You consider how much of it to give him, the whole night, or just the shape of the lesson it eventually taught you, and you decide in the end on something closer to the whole truth than the comfortable version, because you remember how much it helped you that first year when Patrick and Antoine and even Henrik in his own gruff fashion chose honesty over comfort in what they told you. "There was a ball here," you say, "bigger than anything this city's ever seen, before or since, probably. Cost more money than either of us will earn if we work every day for the rest of our lives, combined together." And outside, while it was happening, there was a whole city standing in the cold, some of it just curious, some of it furious, because half the men in this city were out of work that winter, and here was a single family spending a fortune on flowers and ice sculptures like the rest of the world wasn't happening at all just outside the window. What happened to them, the family? Left the country eventually. Taxmen came after them once the papers started writing about it, and they didn't like the attention, so they packed up and went across the ocean where nobody asks so many questions about a fortune like theirs. Tomas is quiet for a moment, taking this in, still watching the golden turning shapes of the dancers below through the gap in the panelling. "Doesn't seem fair," he says finally, "that they got to just leave, that nothing worse happened to them than having to move somewhere else nice." "No," you agree, "it doesn't seem fair. I've thought about that a great deal this last year, and I still haven't found the part of it that seems fair to me. But I'll tell you the thing I have found, thinking on it this long." You pull him gently back from the gap, the way Willem pulled you, mindful of the same danger of being caught with your face pressed to the wall. That family had everything that night, every advantage this city could offer a person. And even so, something about what they did caught up with them anyway. Slower than it would have caught up with you or me if we'd done something half so foolish, and gentler by far, but it caught them regardless. There's a kind of comfort in that, even if it isn't the comfort of real justice. The world does still seem to keep some kind of account, even for people who've spent their whole lives believing they're too big for the ledger to reach. You're not sure saying it, whether you fully believe your own words, or whether you're simply offering Tomas the same kind of imperfect, half-true comfort that Patrick and Antoine and Henrik once offered you. But there's something in saying it aloud that settles it a little further inside your own chest regardless. The way explaining a thing to someone else often clarifies it for the person doing the explaining more than for the person listening. Henrik's voice finds you both a few minutes later, calling you back down before you can be caught idling by anyone who matters, and you and Thomas descend the service stairs together, back into the heat and noise and honest, exhausting labour of the kitchen proper, and you think, walking down, of the earring left on that third step from the bottom 14 months ago, and of Mr. Ahearn's face in the crowd, and of the whole long night that taught you more about this city and the people who run it than anything you'd learned in your first 15 years combined. You think, too, of your father, steady now in his new work, and your mother still bent over her needlework by lamp oil no longer quite so carefully rationed, and the coal that comes now on a regular monthly schedule rather than as a daily emergency, and you understand, walking back down into the kitchen's roar, that whatever else that single night cost you, the burns you never got but watched happen to someone else, the fear in the crowd, the small hard weight of temptation against your leg for a handful of hours, it also gave you something you didn't have before it. Not wealth, not anything so simple as that. Something closer to a map, maybe. A way of understanding the shape of the city you live in that you didn't possess before you climb those 13 stories of brick and glass, and that you suspect, walking back into the familiar heat of Henrik's kitchen, you'll be using for the rest of your life to find your own way through it. It's late now, wherever you're listening to this. And if you close your eyes, you can let yourself settle into that same attic quiet that eventually claims every kitchen boy in this story. The hour when the last plate has been scraped clean, and the last pot scoured and hung, and there's nothing left to do but let your body finally admit how tired it's been the whole night through. Picture it with me, one more time, before you let it go. The tenement room on Baxter Street, small and cold in places but warmer now than it was that first February. Coal enough banked in the little stove to see the night through comfortably. Your mother's needlework set aside for the evening, folded neatly beside the lamp she no longer has to ration quite so carefully. Your father's breathing, slow and even from the bed across the room, a man who found his footing again after a hard season, the way most people eventually do if the world allows them even the smallest room to recover in, and you, lying in the dark, your hands finally still after a night, or a year, of ceaseless motion, oyster knives and ice blocks and coal sacks and quail feathers all set down at last, your body settling into the particular ache of honest work well finished. You think of the mirrors one more time before sleep takes you, the way that ballroom folded back on itself, candlelight multiplying into something that looked, for 8 astonished seconds, like infinity itself. You understand now, a year and more removed from that single night, that infinity was always an illusion, a trick of glass and gilt frame, nothing more, dressed up to look like something it was never truly capable of being. Real infinity, you've come to believe, doesn't live in mirrored ballrooms at all. It lives in smaller things, in the exact number of times a mother can find the strength to keep a family fed through a hard winter, in the patience of a man like Henrik teaching a frightened new boy the first rule of a country he'll spend years learning to navigate, in the quiet decision made alone on a shadowed landing, weighing a single small object against everything a person believes about the kind of man he intends to become. You're tired enough now. Tired enough. Tired enough. You have hands that ache in the good honest way that only comes from real work finished. You have a family sleeping close around you, warm enough tonight, fed enough tonight, safe enough tonight. That is more than a great many people in this city could say that winter or any winter since, and you've learned this last year not to take the smallness of that mercy for granted simply because it is small. Let it come then. Let the memory of that single glittering night settle the way snow settled that February, quietly, in its own time, covering over the sharp edges of everything that happened beneath it, without erasing any of it entirely. Let the oysters and the ice and the burned boys' cry and the crowd's cold fury and the earring's small hard weight all fold themselves down into something you can finally set aside until morning. Let the mirrors dim. Let the orchestra's last slow number fade out into silence. Let the swan of spun sugar melt at last, the way it always had to, the way every beautiful temporary thing eventually must. Centuries from now, though it will not take centuries, not really, only a handful of decades, a span of years shorter than you'd think while you're living inside them, this city will have forgotten the exact shape of that single night almost entirely. The Waldorf that seemed to a 15-year-old boy climbing its service stairs for the first time like the tallest and most permanent thing ever built will be pulled down eventually, and something taller still raised in its place, the way this city has never once in its life stopped tearing down what it built the generation before to build something newer, hungrier, more determined to outdo whatever came before it. The mirrors will be gone. The ballroom will be gone. The very street outside, where a crowd once gathered angry and cold in the snow, will fill and empty and fill again with 100 different crowds, carrying 100 different griefs that have nothing at all to do with orchids or ice sculptures, each one just as real to the people living inside it as this one was to you. But something will remain, even after all of that. Not the building. Not the ball itself, which will fade in time into little more than a line in an old newspaper column, a curiosity for people who like to read about the strange excesses of a vanished age. What will remain is smaller than that, and stranger, and somehow more durable. The simple fact that a boy once stood on a landing with a fortune in his palm and set it down anyway, because some other accounting mattered more to him than the money did. The fact that a mother once sat by a rationed lamp mending another family's shirt to keep her own children fed, and never once let her children see how close to the edge that effort kept them. The fact that a father, worn down by a hard season, still found the strength one grey morning to put his hand on his son's shoulder and say, without a single word needed, that the two of them would find their way through this together, the way families always eventually do, or else do not survive at all. Those things don't get torn down the way buildings do. They pass instead from hand to hand, story to story, the way this one has just passed from an old man's memory into whatever room you're lying in now, however many years and miles sit between you and a cold February night on Fifth Avenue in 1897. The human heart doesn't change much in the end, no matter how tall the buildings around it grow, no matter how many mirrors get hung on how many walls to make wealth look larger than it already is. The need for rest at the end of a long, hard day, that doesn't change either. The comfort of a warm room after a cold one. The relief of hands, finally, blessedly still after hours of ceaseless motion. The particular peace that settles over a person who has done honest work and can, at the end of it, close his eyes without owing anyone an accounting he's ashamed to give. So let it come, the way it came for a tired kitchen boy on Baxter Street more than 100 years ago now. Let sleep take you the way it took him that night, and the night after, and every night after that for the rest of a long ordinary life lived mostly in rooms far smaller and far warmer in every sense that matters, than the mirrored ballroom he once glimpsed for 8 astonished seconds through a half-opened service door. Let the noise of that whole glittering, terrible, beautiful night finally quiet. Let the oysters rest on their ice. Let the coal settle low and steady in the grate. Let the last candle in the last chandelier gutter down to nothing, the way every candle eventually must, no matter how many hundreds of dollars it cost to light in the first place. Let your thoughts slow and soften and finally stop. You've earned this rest, same as he did. Take it and dream. If you dream at all tonight, not of mirrors or of ballrooms, not of orchids flown across an ocean, or jewels once worn by a queen who lost her head for wearing them. Dream instead of something smaller and warmer and entirely your own, a room with enough coal in it, a family breathing steady and close around you, and the quiet, durable knowledge that whatever this world asks of you tomorrow, you have, somewhere inside you, exactly what it takes to meet it. Good night.